All right, today we're going to be learning how to do a stencil screen print. The last lesson was a mono print using a screen. So we are going to use the same screen that we used last time, but we're going to be applying a stencil to the front so that when we pull ink through, we're just getting that image. The first step is to create a stencil. For this lesson, I wanted my students to focus on a place that was really significant to them, that they saw every single day. And then we are going to turn those drawings into the stencils for screen printing. I did choose a place from when I lived in Oklahoma. This is the milk bottle building in Oklahoma City. And this is the drawing that I'm going to use to create my stencil. And I'm just using newsprint. You can use generally any paper. You can use brown paper. You can use like a bond computer paper. This drawing, the first thing that I'm going to think about whenever I am turning this into a stencil is what areas I want to come through as ink and which ones I want to leave as negative space, and start to map out how to create a stencil in the most efficient and effective way. If I wanted these, let's say the actual building and the milk bottle, to be solid color with details, I would have a lot more work for me because I would need to cut out the large areas and then make sure that I either left the marks that I had there as hanging between the areas or re-adhere them to the screen. And we'll get in a little bit more to that when we're actually placing our stencils. I also have a lot more detail in this drawing than I will actually translate into the stencil. And it is always nice to, I will encourage my students to create the most detailed drawings they can, and then learn to select the parts that are most important to show the image that they want to get across. So for me to start, I have decided that I do want the milk bottle to be entirely filled in. And so I have a cutting mat here so that you're not damaging the surface that you're working on. And I'm working with an X-Acto knife. And I'm gonna come in and just cut out the area that I want to print for this first part, for the actual milk bottle. If you are working with newsprint, you want to be careful as you're working with your knife so that the paper doesn't tear, because you will get a different texture out of your stencil that way. All right, so now that I'm pulling this piece of the stencil away, I can see that ink is going to come through that part of the stencil. In this situation, I had this bottle that also had a logo in the center that I did kind of want to come through, but it would have been hard if I had wanted to keep the stencil all in one piece to connect this from side to side. So I'm actually going to take the bottle and cut that logo out. And now that I have this shape cut out of it, I can get rid of this scrap. I don't need this anymore. And I can come in and I can, when I'm adhering this to the screen, I can take this and put this right in the center so that it still is a part of my design. As I'm cutting out the stencil for the actual building that I've drawn itself, I don't want the bulk of the building to print in ink. I just want those lines. So I'm actually gonna come through and pick which outlines I want to show up in my print and cut them out individually. So for this line, I'm starting with this outside of the building, And I've created that line by cutting it out and making sure that I left it attached on two sides. If I were to go through and cut all the way around, I would end up just taking this entire chunk out, which is something that I don't want. So it is good to come in and cut each of these lines individually. All right, now that I have my stencil completely cut out, it's time for me to adhere that to my screen. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my screen and lay it top side up on my work surface. And then I'm going to take my stencil, and since I have drawn this in the orientation that I want it to print, I'm going to place this stencil drawing side down on top of the screen. Whenever you're screen printing, whenever you look through the screen from the back of the screen, you want to be able to see your design in the orientation that you want it to print. Now that I have this laid down, I'm going to come through with some tape and tape it around the edges first. Now that I have the stencil taped to the front of my screen, as you can see, there are some areas that have started to peel up and don't stick down right. So with those, I'm going to come through with just a little bit more of the tape and tape those areas down. Whenever you're doing this, it is important to remember as you're putting the tape down that anything that you tape on top of the screen is also going to act as a resist so the ink won't come through, so that area won't print either. So you will see the tape, and if that's something you're concerned about, that's something to think about whenever you're at this step in the process. Now that I have my stencil completely taped down, I can start to think about things like the logo that I had left off before. Since this was something that was going to be hard to connect inside this milk bottle, that's when I can come through with this scrap that I've pulled out, and I can place it here, and then I'll put a little bit of tape on it so that it'll stick and act as the resist that I want it to. All right, now that I have my stencil adhered to the front of my screen and I have my printing area set up with both newsprint to print proofs or test prints and final print paper, I can go ahead and get into the printmaking process. For this print, we're going to be doing a split fountain, which means that the print will have a gradient from one color of ink to another. So the first thing to think about whenever you're laying out your ink is if you want the gradient to move horizontally or vertically across your print. Because I want the milk bottle on the milk bottle building to be one color and then fade into another, I'm going to have my split fountain move horizontally across my screen. So to do that, I'm going to lay the ink out this direction, moving from one color to another. As I'm doing this, I'm going to put just I would say about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick line of ink. And then stop about halfway through what I'm printing, and I'll lay out the same thickness of ink over here. All right, now that I have ink on my surface, I want to create a line that I can print with. All right, so I'm going to take this ink and make sure that it's aligned with my printing area. And bring them up to each other, and then I will take my squeegee, and since this is the first print in our split fountain, I'm gonna wanna pull a couple of times so that the gradient blends nicely together. Again, you're pulling this at about a 45-degree angle. I'm just trying to pick up some ink, move it across. All right, now that we have that proof printed, I'm gonna move to my next printing space. All right, and now I'm moving onto my final paper.